Welcome to Hangar 51 Files, where history's secrets, classified operations, and hidden truths come to light. From Cold War black ops to the future of warfare, from lost artifacts to emerging defense technologies, we investigate the stories buried beneath official narratives. No speculation, no clickbait, just hard-hitting research, expert analysis, and the pursuit of truth. You're now inside the briefing room. Stay sharp, stay curious. This is Hangar 51 Files.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get to the heart of complex topics. You're listening because you want knowledge fast, you want it thorough, you value different viewpoints, and you want those aha moments without feeling buried in detail. Today we're tackling something heavy, really significant, Japan's Unit 731 during World War II and the whole complex story of how that information was handled afterwards.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a range of sources. We're looking at historical analyses, scientific papers, even primary documents, from the National Archives. There's also work of fiction we'll touch on, which sort of illuminates the ethical dimensions.
Right. And our mission today is pretty clear. Extract the absolute must-know insights about Unit 731, the human experimentation, which is horrifying, and the complexities that followed, especially the U.S. involvement after the war. We aim to give you a really clear, structured picture of this tough history.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. One of the first things that really strikes you is the silence, the veil of secrecy after the war. That's a crucial starting point. You see this post-war sanitizing of Japan's history almost immediately. For example, Japanese textbooks, they barely mention wartime excesses at all until, the early 1990s. This wasn't accidental.
Right, not just an oversight. And you mentioned American occupation officials were actually involved in this. Why? What was the thinking there?
Well, you have to see it in the context of the emerging Cold War. The U.S. priority was building Japan into a stable, strong ally in Asia, fast. So shining a harsh spotlight on Japanese medical atrocities, like the intense focus on Nazi medical crimes, was seen as potentially destabilizing, bad for the bigger strategic goal. It's a pretty stark insight, actually, this trade-off between justice, historical truth, and immediate geopolitical needs.
It's quite something to think that for decades, most people outside of maybe specialist circles just didn't know the scale of this, not until the 80s or 90s. Our sources even bring up a novel, Endo Shisaku's The Sea and Poison. Why is that significant here?
The Sea and Poison is important because, while it's fiction, it's based on a real event, the vivisection of a captured American pilot in Fukuoka. It really drives home a disturbing reality, that medical professionals, senior doctors, interns, nurses, they participated. And the truly unsettling detail from the actual event that inspired the novel, apparently no one objected. No one protested being assigned to take part.
Wow. That really paints a picture of the atmosphere at the time. Okay, let's shift focus a bit. The authority behind Unit 731, what about Emperor Hirohito? How involved was he?
That's a key question, and it's complex. Officially, Hirohito was often portrayed as bound by the Constitution, maybe somewhat removed, but the evidence we have suggests he signed off on pretty much every major government proposal, including the military's. His close advisors, many with strong military ties, kept him briefed on things like the biowarfare and chemical warfare programs. And yes, that included the human experimentation aspects.
So it wasn't just a symbolic nod. His approval was necessary.
Constitutionally, yes. His signature was required for these military actions. And specifically, there were two imperial decrees in 1936. These directly authorized the creation of the army units doing this biowarfare research, like Unit 731. It shows real authority, not just passive agreement.
So the system allowed for these atrocities to be greenlit right from the top. And it seems this wasn't happening in a vacuum. You mentioned a wider climate of impunity in 1930s Japan.
Absolutely. The 1930s in Japan were incredibly turbulent. Politically unstable, you had this surge of ultranationalism. Assassinations of political and military figures were, disturbingly frequent. Think of Prime Minister Hamaguchi Osachi or Premier Inukai Tsuyoshi. And what's really telling about the Inukai assassination, no one was actually punished for it.
That sends a powerful message, doesn't it? A chilling one.
It does. And then there was the plot that killed Marshal Cheng Solin, the warlord in Manchuria. The plotter got away with it. And that event directly helped pave the way for Japan's full takeover of Manchuria. So yes, this environment, this lack of consequences, it definitely fostered a sense that extreme actions were possible. Permissible, even.
And this culture, this lack of accountability, it wasn't just politics, was it? It seeped into other areas, like medical training.
That's another deeply concerning layer, yes. Japanese medical education back then. It focused heavily on the technical side. treating the sick, the wounded, but largely without the ethical framework, the moral considerations we'd expect today. It just wasn't part of the core curriculum in the same way.
You mean things like the Hippocratic Oath or similar principles they weren't taught?
Exactly. No real Japanese equivalent was emphasized. And perhaps more importantly, there weren't strong laws protecting patients from, say, non-consensual treatment or experimentation. It was quite different from the West, where even then, there were efforts, laws emerging, to provide those safeguards. The underlying assumption in Japan seemed to be simply that doctors would, well, do the right thing.
That's a stark difference. Okay, let's get into the specifics of the units themselves. Unit 731 is the name everyone knows, but it wasn't alone, right? What does the number of these units tell us?
Right. Unit 731 is the most infamous, based in Pingfan, Manchukuo, led by Dr. Ishii Shiro. It was huge, around 300 medical and scientific staff, plus maybe 2,700 support personnel, all hidden behind this benign name, the Anti-Epidemic Water Supply and Purification Bureau. We even have images showing how massive the Pingfan complex was. And artwork depicts just horrific scenes, victims staked out for germ experiments, live dissections, then the orders to kill all remaining prisoners at the war's end, destroy everything. The sheer existence of multiple units tells you this was large-scale state-sanctioned.
So Pingfan was the biggest, but there were others.
Oh, yes. Unit 100 in Changchun, also Manchukuo, that was the second biggest, run by a veterinarian, actually, focused on plant toxins, animal diseases, but also human experiments. Their cover was the Anti-Epizootic Protection of Horses Unit.
Then you had the Mukden Army Medical College. They use human subjects expensively. Unit 2646 in Haler. Unit 1855 in Beijing reports say at least 300 killed there. And Unit I-1644 in Nanking, that was a major BW unit commanded by Masuda Tomasada. They experimented with plague, anthrax, typhus, killed hundreds. They even supplied germs to Unit 731, finding those 28 skeletons at the Nanking site in 1998. Just grim confirmation.
It's chilling how extensive this network was. And Pingpan, you mentioned it was set up after issues at an earlier site. That's right. The first main facility at a place called Bayinye had problems. A prisoner revolt, some kind of explosion, secrecy was compromised. So Ishii basically argued very persuasively up to the highest levels, including Hirohito, that his work was vital and needed a new, more secure, purpose-built location. That led directly to the 1936 imperial decree setting up the Water Purification Bureau at Pingfan. A perfect cover for what they were really doing.
The experiments themselves. We have some examples. It's almost impossible to comprehend the cruelty.
The sources detail things that are, almost unspeakable. You had sort of freelance research, too, in occupied zones, like malaria experiments in Rabaul, New Britain. Hirano Inuska used POWs, injected them with infected blood. People died.
Appalling. And not just in remote areas. These happen in established institutions, too.
Tragically, yes. Vivisection, sponsored by the government, happened within prestigious medical schools. Kyushu Imperial University in Fukuoka is one example. Senior professors, interns, they participated. On POWs, civilians, the procedures. Replacing blood with seawater, removing organs while the person was alive, cutting off blood flow just to see how long death took, drilling into skulls. It's just hard to process.
Staggering cruelty. Which leads to the question, what did the U.S. know about all this, and when, and what did they do?
Right, this is where the story gets even more complicated and, frankly, disturbing. Thanks to declassified records, we know the U.S. had a significant amount of awareness, and earlier than many people think. As early as 1944, there's a War Department summary warning Japan could easily mass-produce biological and chemical weapons. Even earlier, by 1941, U.S. intelligence believed Japan was trying to get hold of virulent yellow fever strains, specifically for bacterial warfare.
So awareness was definitely there, not just vague suspicions.
No, quite specific. You have the Thompson Report in 1946. It drew on interrogations of key people like Ishii himself and Dr. Kitano Masaji. It detailed the Harbin facilities, the BW and CW bombs. And then there's the post-war decision. The U.S. and Britain agreed not to charge Emperor Hirohito as a war criminal. This was despite Australia actually listing him as one in 45-46. The U.S. Army G2, their intelligence branch, was very interested in whether American POWs were used in experiments, especially at Mukden camp. Initial reports, based on affidavits they had at the time, said no, but later documents contradicted that.
Okay, so they knew a lot. What about the perpetrators, like Ishii and his team? Were they held accountable?
This is probably the most controversial part. There's a 1947 memo from SKAG2, that's MacArthur's headquarters, which is pretty explicit. It states, and I'm paraphrasing slightly, that documentary immunity from war crimes will be provided to Ishii and others. The price. Full cooperation and disclosure about their BW research. Ishii was interrogated in 1947. They discussed the experiments of Pingfan, including human ones. But the immunity deal wasn't finalized right at that moment. Then you have the Fell Report, also 47, summarizing findings. It stated positively that no American or Russian POWs were used, which, again, other documents seem to contradict.
It really sounds like a conscious decision. Intelligence over justice, but wasn't there pressure to prosecute? A moral imperative?
There was some push. The War Department's own War Crimes branch called for evidence against Ishii's group in 1947. But SCA Legal told them, essentially, that while accusations existed, the Japanese Communist Party even accused Ishii of experimenting on Americans at Mukden. The International Prosecution Section felt there wasn't enough solid legal evidence for trial. There's even one SEA G2 report from 47 suggesting the Japanese deliberately bombed their own facilities near the end to destroy evidence. Convenient, perhaps.
And the U.S. interest in the data from these horrific experiments was clearly high value, wasn't it?
Immense value. A 1947 Summary of Information on Shiro Ishii for the War Department, G2, mentions the allegations he injected U.S. POWs with plague. And G2 itself described these experiments, the data from them, as being of the highest intelligence value. There's a 46 document accusing Ishii of injecting plague into live subjects. SKP Legal wanted him for questioning, but initially not labeled as a war criminal suspect. We also see a 1945 U.S. report, Biological Warfare, Activities and Capabilities of Foreign Nations, which actually had detailed diagrams of Pingfan. That was really the first comprehensive U.S. intel picture of the main site. Post-war, the U.S. actively exploited, that's the term used, Japanese intelligence assets, even recruited people with very dark pasts. The Merck report for the Secretary of War confirmed Japan was developing offensive BW. A 46 legal section summary flatly described Ishii committing experimental atrocities on American, Chinese, and Japanese. Yet that 47 SCP-T2 memo pops up again, immunity for cooperation. It's a stark contrast to the Soviets, who did hold the Khabarovsk trials after the war, prosecuting Japanese personnel for BW crimes.
The whole picture raises profound ethical questions, doesn't it, about intelligence, justice, and national interest. Why is understanding this history with all its uncomfortable truths so important today? From an accountability perspective, it's just incredibly complex.
Well, including Unit 731 alongside, say, the Nazi medical atrocities and ethics education, especially medical ethics, is vital. It does a couple of things. It reinforces the absolute need for ethical vigilance, for reflexivity, and it forces acknowledgement of moral catastrophes that maybe aren't as widely known as the Holocaust, but are profoundly significant. Every instance of this kind of brutality has its own unique historical, political, moral context. And exploring those complexities is incredibly valuable for learning and remembrance.
It underscores that these ethical breaches aren't confined to one regime or one moment in history. Okay, so where does this history stand now, particularly in Japan? Is it openly acknowledged?
Well, for a long time, the official Japanese government position was basically that all wartime issues were settled by the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty. They resisted acknowledging responsibility. Some politicians even actively denounced the accusations as slander. However, more recently, things have started to shift somewhat. Individuals within Japan have come forward with documents, government records, private papers, things saved from destruction. That's added enormously to the historical picture.
That sounds like progress, at least. What about in schools? How is it taught?
That's been contentious, too. There was a famous textbook controversy. The Ministry of Education wanted a reference removed, one alleging Unit 731 experimented on thousands of Chinese, claiming lack of academic proof. But as more evidence emerged, they eventually had to back down on that specific point. It shows the ongoing struggle, the push and pull, in confronting this past. It's also worth remembering the U.S. push to figure out Japan's BW capabilities got really intense right at the war's end. They were worried about Japan using these weapons as a last resort. There were U.S. Army studies, like one in 1945, looking into a 1941 plague outbreak in Changtad, China, strongly suspected to be a Japanese BW attack. British reports covered similar allegations. And finally, there's this almost unbelievable detail. An offer was apparently made to the U.S. Access to all the Japanese data on human disease susceptibility data obtained through these horrific experiments, data the U.S. couldn't ethically get itself in exchange for basically letting the scientists involved off the hook, sparing them embarrassment. It just highlights, again, the incredibly difficult, morally fraught calculations being made right after the war.
This has been a deeply challenging but essential deep dive, a really dark and complex part of history. Let's try to summarize the core takeaways for everyone listening.
Okay, so we've seen the horrifying reality of Unit 731's human experimentation, and that it wasn't isolated, there were other units doing similar work. We've also unpacked the post-war suppression of this history in Japan, and how the U.S., for strategic Cold War reasons, cooperated in that silence. And then the slow, painful process of uncovering these truths through declassified files, persistent research, and even individuals in Japan bringing evidence to light.
Right. And that leaves us with a final thought for you to consider. When we look back at these ethical compromises made 50, 60, 70 years ago in the name of national security, what are the long-term consequences of burying histories like this? What responsibility do we carry today to ensure a full accounting? And how do these ongoing debates about memory, accountability, and truth shape how we understand ourselves and the world right now? Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.
That's it for this episode of Hangar 51 Files, where we uncover the hidden, investigate the unexplained, and challenge the official story. If you found this episode insightful, make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with those who refuse to accept surface-level narratives. For more deep dives, exclusive research, and behind-the-scenes content, visit www.hangar51files.com, our YouTube channel, at Hangar 51 Files, or our Substack, hangar51files.substack.com. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and keep questioning everything. This is Hangar 51 Files, signing off. No speculation, no clickbait. Just hard-hitting research, expert analysis, and the pursuit of truth.